The quote that you just saw comes from John Haggerty, the creative director and founder of one of the top advertising agencies in the world. When he had to promote a product for a client, he would take a picture of that product, and below it he would write a sentence. It would be a simple, single-minded idea that would need to make rational sense, but also suggest something interesting on an emotional level about that product. If the picture and the text worked well together, he would look at them and say, "There's the first ad in the campaign. It's my job to create something better." So why am I telling you this? Because even a basic proto ad, like the one Haggerty used to do before he started working on the actual ad, would probably be better than 99% of the ads that you see today. The reason for this is simple. Back in the day, advertising used to be done by a handful of people for a handful of companies. These people were very passionate about their job and they took it very seriously. They discovered many of the first principles that are behind some of the best ads in history. One of these principles is embodied in that quote from Haggerty. An ad must be interesting on a rational and on an emotional level. The worst sin that an ad can commit is to be emotionally neutral for the customer. Nowadays, anyone with a Facebook or a Google account can do advertising. This industry has become commoditized. While this process has been undeniably great for many people, it also led to an influx of mediocre ads made by people who aren't even aware of what makes an ad good or bad. Most of the ads that you see today have precisely zero emotional impact. You're now forced to compete in a market that is oversaturated by mediocre ads, where most people are conditioned to ignore them. If you're not a creative person, you probably also lack the ability to create better ads than that. Good luck standing out in this market. Obviously, we still have plenty of good advertising agencies that are very capable of producing great ads, but they are not exactly cheap or willing to work with anyone on the street. You can't just go to Leo Burnett, knock on their door, and ask them if they will create an ad for pocket change. You'll get laughed out of the room. So what are you supposed to do? You lack the capability and the creativity to develop ads that are better than average, but you also can't afford to work with a top ad agency. Does this mean that you should just accept this and deal with it? Not necessarily, because I'll tell you a secret. The top advertising agencies would like you to believe that what they are doing is magical, or at least so complicated and high skill that average entrepreneurs aren't able to do on their own. While this is somewhat true in some rare cases, the rest of the time things are much simpler than that. What advertising agencies are doing most of the time is using industry tricks and old school principles. Tricks that you don't know about and they do. Yes, even those big and expensive agencies are using tricks instead of relying only on creativity. Today I'll teach you some of these tricks. If you use them properly, your campaigns should be good enough that most people won't be able to tell that you didn't pay an advertising agency to do them for you. Basically, we'll apply the Pareto principle for advertising. The stuff that I'll teach you here will give you 80% of the results for 20% of the effort. You might not show your ads at the Super Bowl, but you won't be ashamed of them either, and you can be sure that they will be better than 90% of the ads that you see all around you. So let's start with the boring part first. Before creating any ads, you must know your target audience. This is important because if you have a set amount of money that you want to spend, it's better to spend it on people that could actually buy your product or service instead of spending it on random people and hope for the best. When it's your own money involved, the last thing that you want to do is to throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. This is why targeting filters are required. Now, if you're watching this video, I assume that you already have a business or a minimum viable product or at least an idea, which means that there's a good chance that you already know who your target audience is. For this reason, I won't waste too much time on this. To keep a long story short, you need to use demographic and psychographic filters to home in on your audience. For basic targeting, you can use the ones that you see on screen now. If you want to go crazy with this, I'll link to an infographic in the description and you can use that one. Now that we've got targeting out of the way, let's move on to the more interesting stuff, the objectives. Most people have a skewed image about advertising and they don't really know when it should be used and when it shouldn't. First of all, advertising is not a universal solution. It's just a tool. Like all tools, it can solve specific problems. These specific problems that advertising can solve should overlap with your objectives. If your objective is not on this list, then perhaps advertising is not the right tool for your problem. So what problems can advertising actually solve? Well, there are 4 of them. The first is notoriety. Notoriety means how well known is the brand or the product and how easy it is for customers to remember it when they think about that specific category of products. The second is brand positioning. Think of it as that place that you want to own in the consumer's mind. What benefits do you want them to think of when they think of your brand? Why should they buy your brand instead of others? You can watch my previous video about branding for a more in-depth look. The third objective that you can focus on is market penetration. For example, if you have a target market of 5 million people, the goal might be to convince as many people as possible to buy your product at least once. A campaign focused on market penetration starts with the assumption that the product is good enough that if you convince people to buy it once, they'll get hooked. The fourth and final objective is frequency. Frequency means how many times the product is bought in a certain period of time. There are products that can have a market penetration of, let's say, 80% because they are bought once out of curiosity, and afterwards they have a very low frequency. If you focus on frequency, your goal is to increase this number and convince your customers that your product belongs into what's known as the habit buying category. Now that you know what problems advertising can solve, here's a few problems that advertising cannot solve. Advertising won't work if your product or service is bad, your employees are treating your customers like trash, your prices are significantly higher than your competitors without having the brand equity to justify those prices. If you don't fix the problems and insist on doing advertising anyway, you'll find out soon enough that you're just throwing money out the window. But let's assume that you don't have any of these problems and you're ready to start. Now it's up to you to choose what objective to focus on. Realistically speaking, most people will focus on market penetration if the business is young, or focus on frequency if it's a more established business. Notoriety and brand positioning are usually the territory of the big brands. Ironically, most of these big brands don't actually need more notoriety or better brand positioning, but they need to keep the engines going so they remain top of mind. If they stop advertising, they risk losing market share to someone else. This doesn't mean that if you're a small player, you should never focus on notoriety or brand positioning. You should totally do that if the target market that you're addressing is small enough and you can afford it. Otherwise, you should treat them as secondary objectives. Every time you advertise with the goal of increasing market penetration or frequency, your notoriety will increase as well. And if you're smart with your message, you can also do brand positioning and build some brand equity. Remember to watch my video about branding to understand brand equity, because it's a pretty big deal. It's not the video that's a big deal, but the topic discussed there. Now that we've got the basics covered, it's time to get practical. How do you create a good ad? You can think of it as a 3-step process. You have the strategic idea, the creative idea, and the executional idea. A simple way to remember them is the following. What are we communicating? How are we communicating? And how are we communicating and adapting our creative idea for this channel? I won't insist much on the executional idea, because when I'll address the creative idea, I'll also show you examples there. Let's look at the strategic idea first, or what are we communicating? Ideally, you'll want to do some market research, or at least be confident that you know your customers well enough that you can determine their wants, their needs, their struggles, and so on. If you know and understand your customers, you'll know how to approach them with a message that resonates with them. Usually, you'll focus on a USP or an ESP. USP stands for Unique Selling Proposition. When you hear USP, think about the features that differentiate a product from its competitors, such as the lowest cost, the highest quality, or the first ever product of its kind. Simply put, what do you have that your competitors don't have? ESP stands for Emotional Selling Proposition. It involves building unique emotional associations with the brand or the product. Think of an ESP as an emotional trigger that prompts a person to buy your product. In this day and age, where products are so similar to each other that we can barely talk about USPs, most ads will focus on an ESP instead. It's even more profitable to do it that way as well, because products come and go, but emotional attachment to a brand persists longer.
Obviously, if you have a very strong USP, you should focus on that as well, at least until your competitors catch up to you and that USP becomes irrelevant. No matter what you choose to communicate to your customers, it's important to put some thought into it, because sometimes it can backfire if you didn't do your homework properly. Let me give you a real-world example to illustrate this better. I once worked with a client who sold non-alcoholic wine. The business was going great and people were very happy with his products. As soon as we started increasing his market penetration, the issues arose. These new potential customers weren't too happy being targeted with ads for this product. What was the issue, you might ask? Well, his current customer base was built on people who actively sought his products. They did research on them, bought them, and then became loyal customers. These new people that we were targeting, even though they fit the consumer profile, they didn't know what this product was. Their main concern was that this was some kind of fake wine made with chemicals or other stuff. We realized this only after the campaign started. We were so confident that the product was good enough to speak for itself that there was no need to explain it to people. This was a mistake. We had to completely change the strategy and address the issues by informing people that this is actually real wine that just had the alcohol removed from it, without any trickery or chemicals added. The moral of the story is that when developing your strategic idea, pay attention to what you choose to communicate and make an effort to understand your customer. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the creative idea. This is the bane of many entrepreneurs' existence. You might know exactly what you want to communicate, but when it comes to actually turning that idea into an ad, that's when things get messy really fast. This is usually where most entrepreneurs stop trying and end up with a mediocre ad, or those who can afford it choose to work with a good advertising agency where they'll probably end up paying an arm and a leg. Luckily for you, there's a framework for creativity. Yes, you heard that right. It turns out that creativity is not actually such a black box as everyone thought after all. If you analyze all the successful ads in history, almost all of them fall into 7 patterns. I will now show you these patterns, and once you understand them, you'll see how easy it is to create ads by using them. I'll also be showing examples on screen, so pay attention. The first pattern that we'll look at is called the absurd alternative. Instead of focusing on how the product will solve a problem, we suggest an absurd solution to the problem. Seeing this extreme solution, the viewer will understand that our product is the preferred option. Next is the extreme consequence. Instead of focusing on the promise, we exaggerate its consequence. The third is inversion. It's similar to the extreme consequence, but we flip it on its head. We don't show the customers how good it will be to have the product, but instead we take the consequence of not having or using the product to the extreme. We then have unification, where we take an existing resource and we give it an additional task in order to support the message. The fifth is the metaphor. We connect our product to a symbol that has pre-existing associations with the message. Then we find a strong way to link the symbol back to the product or brand so that they will be visually fused together. Next we have activation. We invite the prospect to perform a physical action, experiencing the message instead of hearing or reading it. This results in increased impact and memorability. Finally, we have reduction. We remove at least one of the essential components of an ad and consider in what way this can strengthen the message. By using these patterns, I can guarantee you that your ads will be significantly better and more memorable than most of the ads that you see today. Keep in mind though, that having a good ad is not enough if you don't know how to actually spend your budget properly. My next video will teach you how to increase the performance of your ads, sometimes even by up to 100%, just by tweaking your budget and your timing. Consider subscribing if you found this video useful and you want to learn more.